Hey, so this is going to be my last video, and I want to talk about the marriage relationship and the scientific method as a satirical element of the story in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark. So looking at the marriage relationship between Aylmer and Georgiana, Aylmer's question of asking Georgiana if she would consider removing the birthmark that she has on her face, which is that's the first interaction we see between the two of them. Her response to that is, she says this, quote, "No, indeed," said she, smiling, but perceiving the seriousness of his manner, she blushed deeply. "To tell you the truth, it has been so often called a charm that I was simple enough to imagine it might be so." End quote. So that's on page 262. It's right at the beginning of the story. And we see that when Aylmer introduces this prospective idea to her of removing her birthmark, it immediately causes shame in her. She blushed deeply. And she makes the statement that she calls herself simple. "I had been so simple, so ignorant, so naive, as to think it would be beautiful." So she actually, at the beginning of the story, thinks it's a lovely thing, and doesn't see what Aylmer sees in it, or isn't repulsed by it the way that he is. And she has this self-demeaning comment to sort of put herself down in order not to rock the boat with her husband, so to speak. So we see this immediate setup of their dynamic with him in almost this power position, and her being subversive or subservient is a better word, and just wanting to let him make the decisions and create their dynamic, and she will do what she can to keep the peace. And there's another quote on page 263 that says, quote, "Seeing her otherwise so perfect, he found this one defect grow more and more intolerable with every moment of their united lives." I think I used this in the previous video too, but it's just this idea that Aylmer is choosing to let this one aspect of his wife dictate their entire relationship, and this birthmark becomes this central feature to essentially all of their other interactions that we see throughout the rest of the story, and him trying to remove it, and wanting to see his wife in her perfect beauty. And we see her response to her husband also on page 263, as this starts to become the central part of their relational dynamic. It says, quote, "Georgiana soon learned to shudder at his gaze." End quote. So his fixation on this feature is poisoning their relationship. She feels shame. She's feeling fear, I think would be an appropriate word, to shudder, to distance herself from him. There's this divide that's being created between them because Aylmer has chosen to fixate on this. This wasn't something she chose. This wasn't something she pointed out. It was his decision to make this such a central part of their relationship. And so she comes to a place where she just wants him to be happy. She wants him to not feel such abhorrence and disdain towards her. She wants him to think that she's beautiful. And so when he starts asking some questions about what it could look like for him to use science to get rid of this birthmark, she says on page 264, quote, "Danger is nothing to me, for life, while this hateful mark makes me the object of your horror disgust, life is a burden which I would fling down with joy." End quote. I dare you to say something like that without drama. And so she's making this bold statement. "I would be willing to give up everything, to give up my life, to remove this hateful mark that is making you, Aylmer, my husband, look on me with horror and disgust." So she's doing this as a peace offering to their relationship. She wants him to be happy. She wants him to see her as beautiful. She wants him to not have to worry about this anymore. And so she's willing to give up everything for him to be comfortable, to be happy. And we see a really stark contrast. He's a very small character in that we don't see him a lot, and we don't see a lot of diversity in his interactions. But Aminadab, who is Aylmer's servant that helps him in his workshop, Aminadab has one really powerful quote on page 265 that sheds an even starker light on Aylmer and his response to his wife. It says, Aminadab is thinking here as he's watching the two of them interact and watching the pursuit that Aylmer has in wanting to remove the birthmark. And he says, quote, "If she were my wife, I'd never part with that birthmark," end quote. And that's one of the only lines we hear from him, but we see this great compassion that Aminadab has for Georgiana and for her beauty and for her character. And Aylmer's dissatisfaction and unhappiness is just so much starker because we see another character who in no way sees this as a repulsive thing and in no way sees it as a deal breaker for the kind of care and kindness he would exhibit towards Georgiana. And to continue to create this divide between Georgiana and Aylmer, and it's almost as if she keeps raising him higher and he keeps thinking himself above whether her or humanity or however you choose to see that dynamic in a couple different ways. Once she's in his laboratory and they're starting to do these different work to try and remove the birthmark, some that she's aware of, some that she's not. He shows her some optical illusions because he wants her to see the things that he's doing in his lab. And she says, quote, on page 266, quote, "Still the illusion was almost perfect enough to warrant the belief that her husband possessed sway over the spiritual world." He's almost godlike to her, like his pursuit of science, his ability to control the natural and almost spiritual world. We kind of see this as a mockery of the scientific method, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But she just elevates him further. And it's finally on page 268 that we start to see a very small shift in Georgiana. It's very small. And this, as she's reading through Aylmer's scientific journals and the writings that he's done on the work that he's been doing. And it says this on page 268, quote, "Georgiana, as she read, reverenced Aylmer and loved him more profoundly than ever, but with less entire dependence on his judgment than heretofore," end quote. So he's still being elevated. She admires and loves him, but she's seeing something in his work. She's noticing something that we feel he hasn't actually even noticed in his own work. And so it says she has less entire dependence on him, because we've seen this dependence throughout the entire story. And it's almost as if she's seeing behind the veil just a little bit, seeing his humanness just a little bit. And I thought this was such a poignant statement. Near the end of the story, Aylmer, he thinks he's figured it out. He's found exactly what he needs, he believes, in order to remove the birthmark and make Georgiana perfect. And he's so excited. He comes to tell her he's as long as she's willing, he's ready to take this next step for her to be free of the birthmark, for both of them to be free of the birthmark. And upon hearing this, on page 270, we hear this from Georgiana, quote, "Her heart exulted while it trembled at his honorable love, so pure and lofty that it would accept nothing less than perfection, nor miserably make itself contented with an earthlier nature than he had dreamed of," end quote. That's not love. Like, oh, it's such a horrible farce that the author is helping us see that their relationship is not good. It's not true. It's not noble at all or honorable at all. That he has this image of perfection in his mind that she hasn't met. And so he is going to do everything in his power, which she calls love, to make sure she is perfect in the image he's created. Which is also putting him almost in this godlike position. And she dies shortly after saying this line. And so it's just a toxic relationship. Now, 1843, the author, I don't believe Nathaniel Hawthorne is seeking to create a realistic relational dynamic, or at least not in the way that our 21st century stories are necessarily looking at. There is a lot of satire in this. There is this over-dramatization in order to make a point. But my 21st century sentimentalities are having a hard time buying into the relationship. So that's my thoughts on that. And the last thing I want to talk about just quickly is the scientific method, and looking at science as almost the satirical piece, because of how the pursuit of science ends with Georgiana's death, even though Aylmer is successful in removing the birthmark. And so there are these moments throughout the story where there's this mocking tone that comes out. So on page 262, it says, quote, "We know not whether Aylmer possessed this degree of faith in man's ultimate control over nature. He had devoted himself, however, too unreservedly to scientific studies ever to be weaned from them by any second passion." End quote. So Aylmer loves science. It's pursuit. It's his love. He's fully committed to it. And that science is this man's ultimate control over nature, which even in the 19th century was ridiculous. Like, nothing had full control over nature that we knew of or that we know of. And so it's this mocking tone that Aylmer's almost silly for having no other pursuits, not being able to be even distracted from his pursuit of science. And he says on page 264, quote, "I am convinced of the perfect practicality of its removal," end quote. Talking about the birthmark, that there is nothing science cannot do. Of course we can remove the birthmark. I am convinced that absolutely there is nothing that will get in our way of being able to do this. The paragraph at the top of page 265, it just talks about all these amazing pursuits and successes of science. Like, it takes almost half a page just praising the scientific method and everything that it can do, mostly from Aylmer's perspective, as he just celebrates and highlights the wonders of science. We see on page 266, there's this quote that says, "He was confident in his science and felt that he could draw a magic circle round her," Georgiana, "within which no evil might intrude," end quote. So we actually see almost this equating of science and magic, that there is something still beyond understanding, something mystical and magical. And it isn't the scientific method necessarily that we are talking about in the 21st century, but it is still kind of taking, Nathaniel Hawthorne is looking at science and going, is it magic? Like, do we really understand it? Can it really solve these problems we think it can solve? And he's, I think, asking these questions. And we see Georgiana is the character in the story who, as she peeks, behind the veil of her husband's work, she's also peeking behind the veil of science a little bit. And she says on page 268, as she's reading through his journals, quote, "Much as he had accomplished, she could not but observe that his most splendid successes were almost invariably failures, if compared with the ideal at which he aimed," end quote. So she sees that he is reaching for here, and he succeeds in getting to like here. So he meets some of his goals, sort of, but he's shooting so high he can't actually hit the target that he's aiming for, and instead falls short here. And she sees this as a failure of science, and it has a hard time admitting a failure in her husband's abilities. But we also see this as foreshadowing for the way that the story is going to end. And at the very end, the last page, 272, the narrator seems to close with this critique of Aylmer and the scientific method and his science. And this is one of the last lines. It says, quote, "He," being Aylmer, "failed to look beyond the shadowy scope of time and, living once for all in eternity, to find the perfect future in the present," end quote. So he was looking for perfection. He was looking for it in trying to make Georgiana the most beautiful thing he could. But he missed the perfect present. He missed what was going on in the here and now. He was not engaged with his wife, with loving her, with caring for her, with seeing her beauty right here, right now, instead of trying to change it. And so those are the things that I noticed about this story. Thank you so much for listening to this and to my other recordings. I hope you guys were able to glean some things and learn a little bit more about O'Connor's Parker's Back and Hawthorne's The Birthmark. It's been an honor getting to work with you. Thanks so much.